So our first question here, right, is what is heresy? And that was a wonderful point sorry, I missed your name, whoever it was that had that for
Lynn.
us. Lynn, that there's so many different ideas of what it is that heresy can be. And that English word doesn't really quite fit in so well with the Hebrew. Because there's actually 5 rabbinic categories of what make up heresy. There's the idea of minim, the histonim, the kofer b'Torah, denier of Torah, kofer b'ikar, the denier of the fundamentals of faith, as well as the apikoros, right? The apikorsim, someone who's a follower of, goes back to the Greek philosopher Epicurus, this 3rd century BCE philosopher who taught that God doesn't really care what's going on with human beings. It wasn't that he was an atheist, but that God's off doing God's thing and human beings are doing human beings things, or the gods, really, for him. He was a Greek philosopher after all. And the rabbis classify these different ideas in terms of what makes up heresy. And the Rambam, in Hilchot Tshuvot, he goes in actually and he summarizes the conversation from Masechet Sanhedrin, from the Talmud, about heresy and everything it is that's going on there. You guys can see the whole slide, Rabbi? It's all clear? Good.
Perfect, yeah.
Great. So we're not going to read through all of these in deep depth, but just to kind of frame the conversation, so you get an idea of all of the different things that qualify. So these are the people that have no share in the world to come. And they are, right, the atheists, the infidels, the people that, overturn Torah. They don't really believe in it. The dissenters of the idea of resurrection, apostates, the enticers of people to sin, the seceders from the congregation, a public perpetrator of sin, someone like King Joachim, the informers, the leaders who cast fear on the congregation, all of these different people that abolish circumcision. And again, this is just the first of the list, right? The list goes on. The 5 categories of atheists, the minim, one who says there is no God and no omnipotence, one who says there is an omnipotence, but maybe there's 2 or more, right? There's more than one God. That person's also, right? In English, this goes back to what Lynn was saying, the English word atheist is someone who doesn't believe in a God. But here, with this translation of minim, we're doing that as atheist. It's actually someone that believes in multiple gods, that there's 2 or more, or one that says that there is one God, but God has a physical form. And there are all these different ideas then that go into what heresy is. 3 categories of infidels, one who says that prophecy is an invention, or that God doesn't really know what's happening in people's minds and hearts. There are a lot of different things that go into it, right? And this is the last part of that halakha, right? The 3 category people that like ruin Torah, essentially. One who says that the Torah is not God-given, or even if just a single word or a single verse, maybe that's not literally given by God, or one who denies the oral Torah, right? The rabbinic tradition and the way the Torah is explained. So all of these things go into this idea of heresy for the Rambam, as he's, again, summarizing. The Mishnah Torah is him just summarizing the halakha as it's laid out in the Talmud from the Masechet Sanhedrin. And it's fair because there are a lot of famous Jewish heretics, right? To try to catch up on the time I lost at the beginning, I'm not going to play the naming them game, but see how many of these names sound familiar. And these are just a few of the ones that we could go with, right? So we have Korach, right? Rebelled against Moses. Jesus, enough said. Elisha ben Abuya, he was a heretical sage in the Talmud. The Rambam, ironically, for a big list of what qualifies someone as a heretic, for his Guide for the Perplexed, written in Arabic, his philosophical work, he was accused of rejecting miracles and rejecting some other ideas that in the Mishnah Torah, he says you should believe in. And more ironically, maybe, there are people that thought he was a heretic because he wrote a book called the Mishnah Torah, the Second Torah, and laid out halakha without citing the sources, that he just didn't include the minority opinions, the different opinions. It was just, he picked an opinion and he said, this is the answer. Right? There are accounts that his books were even not just banned, but burned in some communities. But it's disagreement about if it had to place or not, different class. Gersonides, the Ralbag, his works were condemned by Shem Tov Ibn Shem Tov and Baruch Spinoza, who is a great famous heretic. My dog's named after him. He was a pantheist. He was a biblical critic. He violated a whole bunch of the things the Rambam said not to do. But there are others, right? Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Rachmal, an Italian rabbi, Kabbalist philosopher. He was excommunicated in Italy for some of his teachings about the Messianic era. And my favorite, actually, he reported that he would have dreams where angels would visit him, which is not so like out there when it comes to Kabbalah. But his dreams, he would say that Moses and even Elijah would come and visit him and refer to him as my mentor in these dreams. And that was really what kind of set the bar and got him pushed out. Right? There's so many. Jonathan Ebschutz, Rabbi Ebschutz,
yeah.
Foreign names are always difficult. Anyway, he was a 1600s to 1700s, a rabbi, halakhic scholar, Kabbalist, major figure in Prague, head of the Beit Din, and still Jacob Emden charged him with heresy, that he was a follower of Shabtai Tzvi, another famous heretic who's not on my list, but also a big deal. But there's some other ones you might not expect, or maybe you do. Shneur Zalman of Liadi. Does anyone know who that is? Right, this is the founder of Chabad, the first Chabad Rebbe. And he was charged as a heretic by the Vilna Gaon, no less, for his teachings and the idea. Right? In fact, many of the Hasidic groups have been charged with this idea, from the Mitnagim, the rest of the community, from just the ideas that tzaddikim have these special mystical powers, and particularly when you get to the idea of resurrection or things, that there's issues. David Zvi Hoffman, German Orthodox rabbi, and he was someone who at the time was a big defender of the idea that the Torah is the literal word of God. He was very much against the biblical criticism that was taking off in some of the non-Orthodox world, but he accepted the idea that from the Wissenschaft movement, that maybe the scientific study of Judaism that was happening in Germany at the time, that maybe in the rabbinic literature we could apply this methods of modern criticism, of higher criticism to the text. And for that, Samson Raphael Hirsch, who's kind of the founder of, or one of the main figures in modern Orthodoxy, right? He accused David Zvi Hoffman of heresy, right? Mordechai Kaplan was accused of heresy and excommunicated by the Union of Orthodox Rabbis for the United States and Canada. And to be fair to their credit, right, we can't necessarily hold that against them, because his colleagues at the Jewish Theological Seminary at the time, people like Saul Lieberman and Louis Ginsburg, also said essentially that he was a heretic and that his Siddur, no one should read it, and he was not really a scholar. He should stick to telling stories rather than trying to figure out Jewish law. To be fair, as insulting as they were, they also came out against the burning of his books that happened in other circles. Rabbi Louis Jacobs, he was set to be potentially the chief rabbi of England, but again, there was a controversy over some of his views, because he took a more nuanced approach to the origin of the Torah, which today in some Orthodox circles, right, there's people that have more nuanced views than what necessarily was happening at the time with Rabbi Jacobs. So what was heresy in these different time periods, some of it, to be fair, is still heresy today. I'm not saying that everyone on this list gets a free pass. But some of the ideas in this have become much more mainstream within some of the movements, if not all of them, some of the denominations. Yeah, I see a hand up, please. Jana. Oh, good to unmute you. Jane. Sorry.
I just wanted to say about Mordechai. I wanted to say about Mordechai. Can you hear me?
Please, sorry.
I just wanted to say about Mordechai Kaplan that my brother-in-law sent me a link, which I didn't read, but the title was that we are commemorating the 100th anniversary of his daughter's bat mitzvah, which was the first bat mitzvah that we know about, just to what has become so commonplace in all the movements for this heretic.
Absolutely, right? It's coming up, I think, in March, actually. but it was 1922 was the very first bat mitzvah in North America at the Society for the Advancement of Judaism. Rabbi, am I allowed to share? At his parents' house, there were so many books, and I'm not a good conversationalist, so I'd awkwardly read the books on his shelf or look through them when I went over to his house. And you have a copy of one of Mordechai Kaplan's books addressed to your father, signed by him, which
my father was a student of his, and he failed his class because the final essay question was, why does Judaism need to change? My father's answer was, it doesn't.
Love that.
On that. But
well, he still liked your father enough, though, to autograph a book and send it to him, unless maybe it was a different message, right? You should read this. But my point is, right, these are figures that have come and gone, and right, Jane, what you said is that some of their ideas have become more mainstream, even if all of them haven't. But let's keep going a bit. The question is, what do we do about heresy? When heresy happens, what do we do about it? And that's where I think things are going to get a little interesting, and where Mark Shapiro's book really was fascinating. So Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, right? Familiar with him? He was the seventh Rabbi of the Chabad movement. And we have here 3 photographs of him. Does anybody notice anything interesting about these photographs? Right? Rabbi Dinan's pointing to his kippah. In 2 of them, he's not wearing a kippah, and the 3rd one he is. So one of them is his student photo from the University of Berlin, where he didn't wear a kippah in it. The other is his United States passport photo. And the 3rd one is his naturalization photo. And when Chabad published this picture on their website, they added a kippah to it. The original version does not have a kippah in it. So that's what we do when heresy happens, right? This is not necessarily in the sense of, right, they thought of him as a heretic. But for a movement that believes you should wear a kippah all the time and emphasizes that, it's a major practice sometimes. An image of the Rebbe not wearing a kippah was a big deal. So what do? They fixed it. They put it in Photoshop, right? They edited it in post, which I hope we're going to get rid of my technological difficulties, Rabbi, right? We're going to edit that out in post, and the final version will be clean. That goes out to the world. Right? This is what we do about heresy. Rabbi Moses Gentili, the author of the Melechet Mashevet, you'll notice here again, right, 2 different copies of his book in the title page, and in one image on the left, the version published in 1710 in Venice, there is no kippah, and the version published in Königsberg in 1860, kippah, right, pre-Photoshop, right, the drawing. But it's fascinating that in one version, it was not a big deal. It's a Jewish book a rabbi published, and the title page, the original version has no kippah on him. And that clearly was acceptable at that time period, but later became not, right? The idea that he would not have a kippah on his head. So it was redrawn and it was fixed. So these are what we do about heresy. We're going to go through some of these a little quicker. Here is a copy of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, published in Amsterdam in 1702. Apologize, there should be a warning, right, for this class, right? It's PG-13 maybe. Because at the top of this edition of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, you'll notice there are some nude women on the title page. So what happened when that book was published again later on? It was censored when it was in the auction catalog for Judaica Jerusalem, right? They just covered it up, the spots that they did not like. Here we go. Here is a copy of the Levush by Rabbi Mordechai Jaffe from Lublin in 1603. And again, there's some imagery around the sides, which was taken care of. They fixed it later on when it was republished in Jerusalem in 2000. Right? Not a very elegant censorship, right? Just photocopying something. It's the old days when rabbis, instead of making source sheets in Word or now in Safari or however rabbis do it these days, right, used to actually cut out and paste on a paper and rescan it when they're making a source sheet, different texts, right? That's this method of cutting a piece of paper and just putting it over it when it was photocopied for the reprint. Great. So I have a couple more. Here's the Shulchan Aruch, Yosef Karo, Venice, 1577 or 78. This one was published. And in Amsterdam, right? The nude lady becomes a naked baby. Naked babies are more preferable than a nude woman. And here we have another copy in the Haggadah, where you'll see we have right, two different versions here, right? One is from Prague in 1526, and that one has, right, topless woman. And in Venice, not even a century later, again, it's changed. We're almost done, I promise. Here is Menachem Abraham Rapaporto's family crest. So we have the version from Verona in 1594. Then which goes from a mermaid to a woman now with a top on her, the B'nai Barak version in 1989. And even that was not enough, because later on, when it was republished in 2010 in B'nai Barak, it became a topless man, right? The topless man was more preferable to a clothed female now in this version of it. So the question you very well might be asking yourself at this point is, right, Rabbi, like, what's the big deal? Okay. It's funny, it's amusing. There's, right, I saw some giggles on the screen, so I'm happy that worked. But does changing some topless drawings of mermaids, right, is that really rewriting history? Is that really making a big difference in anybody's life? And the answer is, I think, yes, right? I think censorship is a real issue, right? For those of you asking what's the big deal, you might be familiar with this. It was pretty big news when it happened, but in not the incident, but the photograph, right? The larger incident, I'm sure everyone's familiar with. This is a picture from the room, the White House, where they were watching during the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound in May of 2011. Rabbi Din, you and I were actually in Israel when that happened. I was at the shawarma shop, like right at the end of the block. And I remember like seeing the news on TV and just hearing everyone was had big reactions. But anyway, so this is a picture of, right, the room. You'll recognize some of the big figures. You've got Barack Obama there, now President Joe Biden, and you also have then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Except when it was published in a Yiddish newspaper in Brooklyn, right, you might notice that both she's gone, as well as another woman, Audrey Thomason, who was the counterterrorism director, right, removed from the photo. So there really is, in censorship, right, it's a rewriting of history. These people are just taken out of the story entirely. This isn't a newspaper in Israel, in another country, but in Brooklyn, New York, where shortly after, one of those women that was removed was running for president, was just written out of this moment, right? And you might remember the story because it was fairly controversial at the time and got a lot of press. Or here, for example, we have another one. Does anyone notice anything different between these two photos? This is from the Feldheim publisher. They published a biography of Rebbetzin Vichna Kaplan, who was an important figure of the 20th century in the Orthodox world. She was married to Rabbi Baruch Kaplan. She was a teacher, she was a dean, and she was a driving force behind the Beis Yaakov schools coming to America from Poland. So she opened the first Beis Yaakov High School in Williamsburg, New York, and later opened the Teacher Seminary, which trained teachers for all of the Beis Yaakov schools in the United States and in Israel. And really that whole movement, right, is thanks to her and her husband and the work that they did. So the picture on the right is from the Feldheim publisher's biography about her. And the one on the left is an original one. So besides the fact that the original was torn and, right, they had to do some editing to fix it up. Did anybody notice anything? Please raise your hand. It's hard for me to see like if anyone has. Oh, I see Elizabeth, please.
Yeah, this woman on the left on the original picture has short sleeves and now they're long sleeves.
Great. I saw Ken. I saw you put your sleeve too. You picked that up as well. Thank you guys. That's wonderful. Right? They changed the sleeves. That was one of them on a couple of the different characters. They gave them longer sleeves. You'll also notice this other woman's neckline has been adjusted. Right? And again, the question is, what's the big deal, Rabbi? It's just a photograph. It's just, what's the big deal? But the question then is, when people say that to be tznius, this is how you have to dress, right? Is a certain way, look a certain way. You have to always have your kippah on, or you have to always have a high neckline or long sleeves, and anything else is not respectable, right? What does it mean? Because here is a figure that has a lot of respect in the Orthodox world. Same with the picture of the Rebbe. And they can't say, right, that they weren't acting in a respectable manner. So instead, they're rewriting history, right? As opposed to the other conclusion is, maybe it's okay. Maybe tznius doesn't mean that you have to, if you're in a group of just women, right, have a neckline that goes that high, or have your arms covered on, may have been a hot afternoon sitting outside, right? But they're rewriting history that she never would have walked out that way, right? It's the old joke of, right, how do you know Moses wore a shtreimel, right? What Jewish boy would ever leave their home without a shtreimel? Right? We're putting the modern day on the past. We know that Moses didn't wear a shtreimel, and we do know that she didn't really have sleeves that long, except in a world where the original photograph gets lost, and we've now rewritten history, and we've lost the tradition and opinion that may well be important. But even now, right, you might be saying it's not such a big deal. So here we have some not photographs. We have some text. This is from the Shulchan Aruch, from Yosef Karo. The custom of kaparot, right? Swinging around the chicken or the rooster before Yom Kippur. And this is what he has to say, right? The custom of kaparot on Erev Yom Kippur, that which people are accustomed to perform kaparah before Yom Kippur by slaughtering a rooster for each male and to say verses over it, you should prevent the custom. The Ramah, the Moshe Israelist, the Ashkenazi halakhic decider, says there are those from the Gonim that write about this custom, and similar, it's written from many Achronim, and so is the custom in all of these countries, and you shouldn't change it, for it's an ancient custom. So for Ashkenazi, the Ramah says that you should still do it. But there's one thing missing. Here's the version from Venice, printed in 1564. And Rabbi Dinan, I'll put you on the spot. Do you notice any difference in the headline on the two in the Hebrew?
Let's see. In the right, Minhag Kaparot Be'erev Yom Kippur V'Sif Echad, and then in the left, Minhag Kaparot Be'erev Yom Kippur Minhag Shel Shtiyot.
Yep.
So the original one it's a custom of silliness or stupidness that is not found in the more recent version.
Right? When it was republished, it was omitted. Now, there are those who might want to say, well, how do you know this is, what he originally wrote? Well, it appeared in the first 18 editions that way. Is it Minhag Shel Shtut?
Shtuyot, yeah. A stupid custom, yeah, or a silly custom.
And it was in the first 18 editions, and 4 of them were published during Rav Karo's lifetime. Right? It's a silly custom. But that was taken out in the later publications of it. Right? His feelings were changed. The author's words were changed. And that's a much bigger deal than maybe just blocking out and censoring some photographs or some drawings on the title page, or changing some pictures of some rabbinic figures. Right? Because that's the version as it's published today. If you went out and bought yourself a copy of the Shulchan Aruch, that's the modern version, the changed version is the one you're going to get. And you're not really going to be reading Karo anymore. Right? Rabbi Meir Yehuda Shapira from 1846 to 1908, he had an interesting teaching. So I'm just going to back up a bit on this one and just give you a bit of background. So he's talking about in Parshat Yitro, when Yitro brings an offering for God, and Aaron and the elders, they enjoy a good meal. They have all these things after Moses comes down with the Torah. And Moses sits the next day as judge before the Israelites. And he judges them, right? And that's where Yitro says to him, right, you can't do this. You can't sit all day. You have to go do other things. But the Torah uses this phrase, the next day. And the rabbinic tradition about this is that it's the day after Yom Kippur. Because what is the next day? It's obviously, like when you're talking about the day, right? It must have been Yom Kippur the day before. And that's what Rashi says, and he cites a midrash about that. The Tosafos, though, noticed a problem. If it was the day after Yom Kippur that Moses sat and judged, well, Yitro brought an offering right before that. So they had an offering. The text tells us that all of the elders and Aaron and Yitro and Moses, they sat and they ate this offering on Yom Kippur then, right? They have a real issue. So the Tosafos say that it wasn't actually, Rashi was wrong. It wasn't actually Yom Kippur that it was just an atonement offering and a general thing. The Midrash, when it talks about it was an atonement, it wasn't really Yom Kippur they meant. It was just a day. But so this is another explanation here. And this is Rabbi Meir Yehuda Shapira, who says a story. So he's telling a Hasidic story about Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Rimmenau. And he says, one time he, right, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, prayed Mariv, right, on Yom Kippur, Mariv that ends Yom Kippur, so early that it appeared to people around him that it was still daytime. And he commanded they bring him some honey syrup to drink, and it was a shock to everyone. Why was it a shock? Because he's praying the Mariv that you pray after Yom Kippur, right, before Ne'ilah has happened, before the gates have closed, before it's really sundown, before Yom Kippur is ended. He's praying Mariv for the next day, and he's eating or drinking. I guess you drink honey syrup. And everyone was shocked. And the holy rabbi said they shouldn't be surprised, because he can see that in heaven the gates have already closed. There's already been appeasement through forgiveness of sins. And now it's the next day. Even though it's not actually the next day, right, by sundown standards, he sees that the gates have closed already. Ne'ilah is done, and it's okay to eat now. It's the next day, right? That's a little heretical, maybe, perhaps, all right? Well, certainly the publishers of his commentary where this appears, because they solved it very artfully in the next version. They just removed the page. When it was republished later in the modern era, the page that this is on is just missing from the work, because it obviously has some serious issues. To imagine that a rabbinical figure is eating on Yom Kippur and saying that you can know the time spiritually rather than by looking up and seeing where the stars are and where sundown is and all of that. So there's a lot of different things. And please, if anyone wants to comment or has any thoughts, unmute yourself or raise your hand. Although it's, again, I can only see a few people at a time on the screen, so I don't know that I really will see everyone, but raise your hand, let me know. All right. Rabbi Moses Sofer, when does Shabbat end? So you'll notice there's two different versions here from the Khatam Sofer, right? Rabbi Moses Schreiber, known the Khatam Sofer, it's the Chidushei Torah Moshe Sofer, right? Khatam Sofer is where that acronym comes from. But so he shares a teaching from his own teacher, Rabbi Nathan Adler from Frankfurt, which is that Shabbat starts 35 minutes before the sun sets and ends 35 minutes after sunset. And that was the practice that his teacher did in Frankfurt, and the Khatam Sofer records that teaching. And in the modern era, when Rabbi Moses Stern reprinted his commentary, that ruling was removed. You'll notice in the lower version, right, that it's a bit shorter. The reprinting down there at the bottom cuts out the parts of the paragraph on the left-hand side because he kept that opinion out. He did not want that opinion in there because it goes against the idea that was accepted in the time of Rabbeinu Tam and many communities at the time who followed Rabbeinu Tam, who's a much stricter opinion. And it's interesting, actually, because the copy we have here at the bottom comes from a pamphlet that was published by a group of Brooklyn Jews who were outraged that Rabbi Stern in his reprint would edit and correct the Chatam Sofer's words, right? That they would reprint it. And they accused him of being like the reformers that edit and cut parts of the Siddur out, right? So this is a group of Orthodox men that really were not happy with this edit. And according to Shapiro, he traces a story that was told from someone who was told from that actually it was the Satmar Rebbe that told Rabbi Stern to remove it. And that Rabbi Stern didn't reveal that until after the Satmar Rebbe had passed away. But again, we have this idea of people that are censoring different rabbinic works, right? They're removing opinions, right? A community that holds by 35 minutes. And maybe that's just their tradition because, you know, that's what their parents did and their grandparents and however it is, and they don't necessarily know why, right? The source that says it's okay is now not in, right, the modern reprint, right? It was removed from it, or at least from Rabbi Stern's version. So here is Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, and he lived from 1835 to 1909, and he wrote a halachic work in Arabic for women to read, which is very ahead of his time. And in it, in one of the chapters, he addresses the question that, right, was a question, I guess, for women back then. It's a question I hear now from people, right, about the obligation for women to cover their hair once they're married. Is it that they always have to have their hair covered once they're married? Or is it only in communities and places where it's a custom for married women to cover their hair? Is it sneaked? Is it modest to go out with your head uncovered in a place where other people do? And so he cites in his ruling that in Europe, it's very common for Jewish women to go out with their hair uncovered even after they're married, because it's very common for women in Europe to go out with their hair uncovered. And that it's not immodest in a place that everyone's doing it, right? The men are used to it, seeing women with their hair uncovered, so they're not going to get too excited. It's not such a big deal in a place where that's the culture, right? So he cites that that's what the women in Europe explain, and that's the answer they give. And he says, these are the words which they answer for this practice, and we don't have a reply to push off this answer of theirs, right? That's not our custom here in Baghdad, but that's what they do in Europe, and we don't really have a reason to say that they're wrong, right? That's at least how I want to read that. And later on, when his work was translated into Hebrew, the publisher had a very sophisticated way of fixing this seeming permission for not covering your hair if you're married and you're in a place where it's not the general custom for people to cover their hair. Anyone take a guess of what the solution was? Right? He just erased it.